Hello everybody, happy Saturday, welcome to Digital Hammurabi. For those of you who are new, my name is Megan Lewis. I am going to mute my Explorer window because I just realized that I have YouTube up so I can keep track of the comments, and you were going to start hearing me twice, which is never exciting. But I am Megan, nice to see you all. I'm an Assyriologist. I run this channel with my husband, Joshua Bowen.
Realize that I have YouTube up so I can keep track of the comments.
Okay, is that me? Yes, it is me. I did it again. I'm just gonna.
That was me.
That was you.
I had Safari open.
No, that's fine. I think we both made the same mistake, but I think we are good now.
Okay.
Yes, I can't hear anything extra. It wouldn't be Digital Hammurabi without some kind of technical glitch. It is what we do, and it's why everyone loves us. But if you've seen any Digital Hammurabi anywhere else except on this channel, you've probably seen my husband, Dr. Josh. He does a lot of Hebrew Bible stuff, teaches Sumerian. But I am Megan, I am the other half of Digital Hammurabi, and today we are talking to Christian Casey, who is a PhD student in Egyptology at Brown University, and interestingly also has a master's in mathematics, which is not a combination I see very often. So I'm going to switch over to Christian and ask him to give a brief introduction and tell us all what his research interests are.
Hi, everyone. That's correct. I'm a PhD student candidate at this point in Egyptology. I've been working on a master's in applied math because a lot of my research is focused on language, and specifically it's focused on using computational techniques to try to learn more than we know now about the sounds of Egyptian language. But I got really interested in it about a year, and I've been like a side project for a while now, so I think that's what we'll be talking about today.
Yes.
Is that Megan?
Yeah, so I saw Christian present a paper at ASOR, the American School of Oriental Research conference in November, and it was really interesting and really fun, and his paper was on Assassin's Creed Origins and their use of Egyptian history in the game, which just, it looks amazing. I actually haven't played it yet because I'm a PhD student with 3 children, which doesn't leave an awful lot of time, much as I wish it did, because I genuinely miss gaming. But that's something for after the PhD is finished. But we're all going to get a taster with Christian, because he is going to tell us about how the game uses Egyptian history, how accurate it is, some of his favorite bits. So if you have questions, put them in the side chat. Either I'll get them or Josh will send them through to me. So we will get started without any further ado. Christian, I sent some questions to Christian before we started today, so I'm just going to jump in with those, and then we'll talk and just see what happens. But I wanted to ask, to begin with, what are your favorite Egyptian features in the game?
So there's a few things that I really like, and I think they did well. So I guess I can go straight to the photos, because that kind of
sure.
That explains this. So I'll do screen sharing. Is that visible? Hopefully. And I just took a few photos, or I selected some of my screenshots to show. So this first one is from inside a temple, and I don't remember exactly where it is. I think it's in Upper Egypt somewhere. But I took this screenshot because if you're an Egyptologist, we talk a lot about daily life and what things would have looked like, but you don't really get to see and experience it very often. So when you're in this game, you spend a lot of time going through various buildings, and they're all decorated inside in this very Egyptian, but also surprisingly, I don't know what the word is, not gaudy, which is what
it's quite restrained.
That's kind of the right. And I think by our standards, it still is kind of a lot more vibrant than the insides of our houses normally are, but it's just not as in your face as we're used to thinking of Egyptian decoration as being. So I thought that was really interesting to kind of imagine a world where these sorts of motifs were common, they were everywhere, but they also weren't completely over the top because, people lived in these places, as opposed to, say, temples where the goal would be to just get as much stuff in there as possible. In your home, you kind of don't want that. So I have a couple of from a house, I believe it's in Siwa, and you can see that they used the same sort of decorative motif, but then there's some kind of subtle differences. And then this is a temple in Alexandria, and you can see that it's a Greek temple. It kind of has the, oh gosh, I don't remember what those things are called, but the series of columns in the style of Athena.
Caryatids.
Yes, I will trust that that's correct.
Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I did classics in high school and then a bit in college. I think they're called caryatids, but I'm very happy to be corrected on that.
Yeah, I would be too, because that sounds correct. I don't really remember exactly. But I think the thing I loved most about these is you can see that they're painted in sort of vibrant colors.
If they painted them, that's very cool.
And I believe that these would have been painted in real life also, but then the makers of this game took it a step further, and they, like, the blue is more faded than the red because blue fades more quickly in sunlight. So instead of being, if you've seen before these images that people make where they take a classical statue and just kind of put bright flat colors onto it, and they're sort of shocking at first, but they're supposed to be more realistic. Mm-hmm. I think Ubisoft did a really good job of taking that idea and then taking it a step further and sort of assuming that, well, if they were painted and they sat outside in the sun all day, they also would have been sun faded and not quite as vibrant as they would have looked when they were freshly painted.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it adds an element of realism that you wouldn't even really think of. You're walking around in this world, and not only are the statues painted as they would have been, but they're also faded by the sun, as they also would have been. So what else do I have here? I got a few daily life scenes that I really liked. So this is a boat procession at or near Karnak Temple in Thebes, and this was a yearly occasion where they would take the god from the temple and put the statue of the god, so like a golden god statue, they would put it in a shrine on top of a boat or a sort of model of a boat, and then carry that boat through the streets and then put it on a larger boat and go across to, the Dar el-Bahri and all the things on the west bank of the Nile in Thebes. And then they did a big circuit and came back to Karnak Temple. So not something you would have seen every day, but certainly something that you would have been aware of. Mm-hmm. And I think they did a good job of capturing that. There's a few other things. Music, I thought they did a good job with that too, because it's, all the texts we have are silent, all of the images that we have are silent, but of course Egyptians were fond of music, and they would have been making music on any given day, and that would have been part of the experience. So just seeing it kind of casually thrown into the game adds an element of realism that, again, you wouldn't really think of if it were missing, but once it's there, you appreciate it.
Yeah.
And then this is probably my favorite thing about the game. So I call this farming, for lack of a better term. But what it really shows is that the part of Egypt that people live in, the Nile Valley, is not a desert. It's a very fertile, lush area. And so when you're there, you're surrounded by green plants and palm trees and crops growing and all those sorts of things that we sort of think of as being normal. But then if you watch any sort of film set in ancient Egypt, they spend the entire time wandering around in the desert, and
right.
It kind of gives the impression that that's what the place looked like, which is of course not true. People lived in the areas where there was water and arable land.
I've never thought about that before, but that's an excellent point, because if you think about things like the Mummy films, they're all set out on the Giza Plateau with the pyramids and the Sphinx, and there's sand everywhere and windstorms and absolutely nothing growing anywhere.
Yeah, it's normally very desolate. And I think that, when we teach new students about Egyptology, one of the first things that we have to try to convince them is that people weren't spending all their time wandering around in the desert. They had houses and fields and trees and all the things that we think just kind of make for a normal looking existence. So I think I'll leave it there and give you a chance to ask another question.
Yeah,
so that
sure.
I'm not just lecturing. So it's a few really great things.
No, and it's absolutely fascinating. And I was going to ask, when you were talking about the the decoration inside the houses, whether you have the research done in Egypt as you do with the classical sculpture and classical temples that suggests that Egyptian temples would have been similarly decorated and similarly painted, and that this image we have of them as everything being sort of flat stone is actually quite unrealistic.
Yeah, I think it's unrealistic in the sense that if you were to look at any sort of grand public building in the United States, so for example, I'm looking at some sort of courthouse with Ionic columns and lion friezes and all these things, in what appears to be white marble just across the street in front of me. Our houses don't really look like that, and you can find sort of similarities. Certain architectural elements are popular. You might find smaller Ionic columns in a person's house, but the sort of the solidness and the grandeur of a public building isn't necessarily reflected in someone's house. And in Egypt, we know for sure that temples were made out of stone and houses were made out of mud brick. And there's kind of a notion that mud brick is an inferior building material. It's certainly less permanent, but it can be equally beautiful, and it can kind of be differently beautiful. So instead of having these hard stone walls where every single inch is covered in some kind of Egyptian art and then they're brightly painted, you would expect to have plastered interior walls just as we have now. And, it's certainly less decoration because the average person doesn't have the time to decorate every surface of their house. Yeah. So I think an Egyptian house would have looked a lot more familiar to us than we sort of initially expect.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, thank you. So one of the other questions, and I'm going to ask these at the same time because I suspect they're related. How much do you feel Ubisoft got right about the ancient world, and if there are any glaring errors that you found?
So there aren't that many glaring errors. There are quite a few little things that aren't quite right, and I honestly at this point I don't even really remember them, because my philosophy on this is that making this world available to people is so much more important than nitpicking the little things that they got wrong, that I kind of just skipped over most of those in my talk. And by this point, it's been about a year, I've just forgotten all of them. The one big thing that I think could have been done better is language. So the game is set in, I think, 59 BC. During the reign of Cleopatra the Great and Ptolemy the 13th, and so we have a good idea of what the language would have been like. This was after all of the major vowel shifts and other phonetic changes that happened between Late Egyptian and Coptic. So we can reasonably guess that the language they would have spoken would have sounded very much like Coptic. What Ubisoft did with the language is to basically use Middle Egyptian, which is 2,000 years earlier than the time period of the game, and then they just pronounce everything using the Egyptological pronunciation. So in the hieroglyphic script, we don't have any vowels written down, and we generally don't pronounce things as though they were Coptic, because if we're dealing with something much earlier, we don't really know whether there's enough similarity for that to be valid. So what we normally do is just take the consonants as they're written and just add E vowels in between. So for example, the Coptic word for to rest is hotep. And then in hieroglyphs, we just have like HTP, and we pronounce it hetep, just for convenience. So you'll often see names like you'll see Amenhetep or Amunhotep, and one is kind of taking the Coptic pronunciation, and the other one is just filling in all the missing vowels with an sound. All of the people in Assassin's Creed speak that sort of Egyptological language, which every Egyptologist recognizes as being a fictional construct for convenience that no one ever would have really spoken. So I thought that was a strange choice, especially when we're dealing with a historic time period where we do know the language, and we actually, I mean, Coptic could easily be used as a spoken language, and was until pretty recently. So I I don't really understand that choice. I did ask them if they would send me the scripts that they used so that I could put them into Coptic instead. And I even suggested that maybe we could like make a resource pack where everything is actually in Coptic. And they were like, no, we're not doing that. No, this is a business. And I understand why they felt that way. I think that's a reasonable response, but I figured it was worth a shot.
It's worth asking.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the one thing. And because I specialize in language and specifically in identifying the pronunciation of this language that there's so much uncertainty about, to me, it was really frustrating that here's this case where we have a great deal of certainty and we didn't kind of take advantage.
It wasn't there. Yeah. That's unfortunate.
Yeah. But, you know.
But you do think that generally speaking, the Ubisoft did a good job at recreating as much of the ancient world as they could, as accurately as they could. I
do. Yeah. And I think the value of that really can't be overstated. So I've been reading Jamie Madigan's Getting Gamers, and it's a book all about the psychology of video games. I think I just finished the chapter where he talks about what's it called? Immersion or spatial presence. And it's this idea that when you play a video game, you're sort of mentally in that place and you form a mental map of the game world and you interact as though you're actually standing in that world. For a reconstruction of the ancient world, that's very powerful because instead of just trying to imagine all of these places, once you play a game like this, you feel like you've visited them. So even if it's not perfectly accurate, the experience of having visited that place is really powerful. And I think it's informative in some subtle ways. So the way that I always like to talk about, because I really love these questions about ancient economics and markets and those sorts of things. In the Assassin's Creed world, you have to buy and sell things. There are markets. There are things you need that you have to obtain in some way. You can obtain resources. Let's say you need a lion's pelt for whatever reason. You can go hunt lions, collect the pelt, and then go into a town and sell that to someone. And it's really obvious when you do it in the game. But then sort of after playing it, I guess I connected the dots and realized that I've kind of always been taught that there was no commodities market in ancient Egypt. So I dug into that a little bit more and found out that it comes from this economist, I suppose, historian from the mid-20th century named Karl Polanyi, who was like a diehard socialist and was convinced that capitalism was a recent invention and that there had never been any markets in the ancient world.
I think I've read the same thing.
What's that?
I think I've read the same thing because we had a similar, like we've got similar evidence in Mesopotamia for like the commercial capitalism that is like very real and very obvious, and you can track it through personal letters and economic texts.
Sure.
And I remember reading, I think also Polanyi, kind of trying to refute this and failing quite substantially.
Yeah, but it's weird how it caught on. So I think if you dig into the details of these ideas, especially in Mesopotamia, where we have so many texts that relate to economic activity, you can kind of prove to yourself that that's not correct and that there was something that we would just naturally call a market, you know, for lack of a better term or a distinguishing term. But then when people talk about things in aggregate, they kind of go back to this notion that markets are a more recent invention and that didn't really exist. Even in the case of Uluburun, which is just very obviously a merchant ship, many Egyptologists and other ancient world scholars have argued that it was a royal expedition because I think there's a gold ring with the name of Nefertiti that was found in the ship.
I think that's right. So for those who don't know, the Uluburun shipwreck is like famous shipwreck that's full of things like copper ingots and like, I think they've got pottery from the Aegean, and it's found, it's like off the Mediterranean coast of like Egypt, Palestine area, Turkey maybe. It's that kind of coast of the Mediterranean, and it seems like the ship was sailing a circuit of the Mediterranean and picking up merchandise from one place, transporting it to another, and selling it either for money or for different objects that they could sell elsewhere.
And I think we'll never really know for sure, but it seems fairly obvious to me that it's a private merchant ship.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not carrying markedly royal objects. It's not very large. It's you know, I guess we could talk about that for a long time, but I would probably need to look some things up to fill out that argument. But yeah. I think the default assumption is that it's a private merchant ship, but then people come back and argue that it must be royal because we've concluded that there is no private enterprise.
There was no market, then it had to be like a royal. That's interesting. Thank you. We've had a couple of questions that I'm just going to get to now before I forget. Jim Majors is asking, how accurately can we predict what music in ancient Egypt would have sounded like?
Oh, not at all, I don't think. So we don't have any musical notation of any sort. So there's a famous Hurrian song, I think, where we do have some sort of musical notation, and that song's been recreated, but we don't have anything like that from ancient Egypt. We do have a few instruments that have survived, and people have played those instruments and tried to recreate ancient Egyptian music. I've never found any of those recreations convincing myself because the music is often simple. I feel like you spend any time in a rural area where they have only analog instruments that they play themselves and in the way that they've passed down for centuries. The music is normally very, very rich and complex. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we've recreated anything like that for ancient Egypt. But I think if we're being reasonable, we should probably assume that they did have rich, fast-moving, complex melodies, and we just don't have any record of them. I think probably the closest thing, if you want to see something that looks like ancient Egyptian music, would be to look at Coptic hymns, and specifically the hymns where they involve instruments. So I think the fourth 𝀭S, that's 𝀭S, which means song. There's a part in there about like making music with instruments, and when they sing that hymn in a church setting, they normally involve instruments as well. And the instruments follow the rhythm of the Coptic language, just as music normally does. I think that's probably a good window into what Egyptian music would have sounded like, but it's not perfect, and it's really the best we've got.
Excellent, thank you. And 825 said that he would like to know what basic shape the homes took.
Basic shape. So the best way to see that is to look at, there's a few different pieces of evidence. So my favorite are the models of Mekhet-Re, which are in the Met, and there are a few buildings among those models with little wooden people in them. That gives you a good sense of what buildings and houses would have looked like. One of them is a house with a courtyard and a columned portico and a sort of pool in the middle, trees and everything. So that gives you a good sense of what a more elegant house with courtyards and things would have looked like. There are these things called soul houses, which were stored in tombs, and they're little clay models of houses, and they normally have a sort of tray on top with a spout. And the idea is that you pour some sort of liquid, probably water, onto the top of this house, and that creates a blessing. But they're clearly modeled on actual houses, so that gives you some sense of what they would have looked like. And then there are various images. I think the Palestrina Mosaic is probably the best source for us because it depicts houses in a sort of Roman art style that we're used to seeing and that we're used to sort of connecting to real life. So if you look at the Palestrina Mosaic, you'll see various Egyptian buildings, and you can kind of from that easily extrapolate what it would have looked like in real life. And then there's places like 𝀭is my personal favorite, where there are still buildings that were built who knows how long ago in the same style that they've been using for thousands of years, and those look like depictions of ancient Egyptian houses. So that can kind of give you a sense of what they would have been like.
Excellent, thank you very much. So I've got like 2 more questions, and then we can just really talk about whatever you want. So something that has come up in conversations I've had with other people, like, can video games be used for teaching ancient history? Should they be, and how successful do you think they can be in a, not necessarily a classroom environment, but in a teaching educational environment?
I think they can be used very effectively. So the Discovery Tour in Assassin's Creed certainly could be used, even probably in a classroom setting. I think it would be a little odd in a graduate seminar, but might be very appropriate if I were to visit, a high school and give a presentation about ancient Egypt. I would be very comfortable using the Discovery Tour. I kind of wonder, well, those things are all very useful, but I think the most useful sort of didactic component of the game is the way that it immerses you in ancient Egypt when you're doing in-game activities like trying to complete quests. So I don't really have this explanation fully worked out, so it's a little ad hoc here. But when you're in the game and you're trying to complete a quest, you're much more focused on the thing that you're doing than you are on the environment or the decorations on the buildings or whatever. And those things become sort of secondary, but the immersiveness of having something to do makes those things much more real than they would be if you're just kind of going through a virtual reconstruction of a place, or listening to a narrator describe things as you just stare at various objects. We don't really spend any time in our normal lives doing that, so it always feels a little disconnected. I think the way that games can be most effective is actually by just giving you something fun to do and letting you run around in this world, because then you're learning without really feeling like you're listening to a lecture or something.
And it would be, at least it is for me when I play, it's much more engaging than, like you say, watching maybe like some poorly done documentaries or sitting and watching a lecture. It's more engaging, it's more realistic if you're completing a task within a specific environment. I feel like I take a lot more in than I would do if I was just passively watching something.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like it makes sense. So for me, I love to travel, but my favorite way to travel is to have a reason to go to a place. Especially if I'm traveling for research purposes. I feel like I enjoy the places I visit much more than I do when I just go and stay in a hotel and visit touristic sites. There's something about having something else to do that makes you feel sort of more at home in a place, like you're supposed to be there, maybe. So yeah, games do that really well. And I think that's something that as academics, we haven't really fully appreciated or taken advantage of yet. It's sort of counterintuitive that just doing some fun activity in this ancient world setting could be also very educational, but I think it's objectively true, and we need to be thinking about that.
And actually linked to that is the last question that I had. Do you get pushbacks from other academics? For example, you recently, like I said, presented this paper at an academic conference. Did you get pushback from people for kind of suggesting that games should be the topic of study? Because for those who don't know, archaeogaming is actually its own field. There are lots of people working on archaeology in games, the archaeology of gaming. So it is something that exists. We're not just sitting here making things up, but it's quite new, and I suspect there may be some people who are less thrilled about it than I am.
I suspect that there are people who are not so thrilled about it. And there's a generational component to that. So I occasionally hear music that's popular among teenagers now, and I think like, well, that's not really for me. I think everybody experiences that to some degree. And if you're much older than us and you've been doing this for a very long time, I think it would be fairly natural to feel like, well, this isn't really very serious, and this is maybe slightly childish. I think it's possible to reach those people, and I don't think you need to convince them to like video games. They don't have to. They should like whatever they like. But I think you can reach those people and convince them that there's something of value here, whether or not they personally like it.
Yeah.
I didn't really get any pushback. So when I first proposed the paper, I told one of my professors about it, and his reaction was, I said, I'm going to present about Assassin's Creed at this conference, and he just went, "Oh no!" And I was like, what's the problem? And he was like, "You can't do that. It will damage your reputation as a scholar. People will take you less seriously when you go to apply for jobs. You won't be taken as seriously, and that can hurt your chances of getting an academic job." And I actually thought he was right. I agreed with him. I thought he made a very good point, and I hadn't thought much about it because it was just something I wanted to talk about. Is there a baby coming? Oh yes. Where is his? Didn't you have like?
He did. He has a new helmet. He outgrew the last one. When Christian met Oliver at ASOR, he had his helmet with Akkadian sleep incantation on it that he has since outgrown. So we have a plain white helmet. But yes, he's supposed to, if he was being obedient, he'd nap for the whole of the interview, but he's decided that he should come and join the fun. So he's going to sit here with me while we keep talking. I had another question.
What was I talking about? Oh yeah. So
about if you had pushback from other scholars for talking about games in an academic fashion. How were you received at ASOR? Because I very much enjoyed your presentation, and the room was packed for that session. It was impressive.
The same thing happened at RC. The room was packed. People were clearly very interested. Multiple people told me that they loved the game themselves and were using it in their classroom or trying to find ways to use it in their classroom. So the reception was remarkably positive. Much more than I expected. And of course, this conversation with the professor made me very nervous because I thought he was probably correct. And I even considered whether I should pull the paper. And I talked to a bunch of my friends, and their reaction was, I had one friend, who also an academic, but his reaction was, do it anyway. See what happens. I was like, yeah, all right. And then it was received very positively, and I didn't really get any negative reactions. I think the people who, surely there are people out there who think it's kind of a waste of time or not really serious academic work, but I think they just sort of politely kept that and let the people who like these things, which is people to do.
Excellent. Actually, you mentioned the Discovery Tour, and I suspect we have some people watching who haven't actually played the game. So can you explain a little about what the Discovery Tour is? And I think you spoke to Ubisoft about it. So maybe what it is and how it was created. Oh, we may have lost the connection. Christian, are you still here?
The Discovery Tour it's like a mode in the Assassin's Creed game. So instead of loading your saved game, you load the Discovery Tour, and then you go to all the same places. So it's the entire game world. It's still an open world. You can go anywhere, but you select a tour, and then there are waypoints along that tour, and you just move from one waypoint to another. And then there's a narrator who comes and tells you about something that you can see from that point. And then there's, in every single waypoint, there's a museum object of some sort or a work of art, and then a description of it and a citation. So which museum it's in, what it's called, normally the accession number and everything. Mm-hmm. It is a much more academic version of the same world.
Sorry, I'm going to mute him.
Oh, he's fine.
And so I can definitely see that being useful for teaching purposes. And I assume that Ubisoft had an Egyptologist on staff for the creation of the game, rather than just doing their own research.
They did, and I should have looked up her name before doing this because I'm just drawing a blank right now. What is her name? Shoot, that. Huh. Well,
I do that all the time.
I know, and it's really bad with names. It will be a name that I've heard and used 100 times, and then it's just randomly not there.
And then 5 minutes after we hang up, you'll think, "Oh, no. I remember it," and then it's too late.
It's too late. But they did have an Egyptologist on staff. I think she's at the University of Toronto, which is near the Ubisoft office that created this game. And I think she did an absolutely wonderful job. The corrections that I would have after having gone through all these things are the sort of minor nitpicks that any of my work would have in it as well. I think it's really of the highest quality. And I have no complaints, except the language. I would have liked the language. I kind of wish they had just asked me to do the language, because I would have done it. I'm very, very cheap, and I would have loved to have done that. But oh well, that's my one complaint. But I think she did a very good job.
Next time, I'm waiting for them to do one set in Mesopotamia, because having that
kind of my wife, because that's her big soapbox.
Oh, I would love it. I would just love it. I think for the same reasons that you love Odyssey Origins. Like you don't get to walk around these places anymore because obviously they don't exist. And even the best reconstructions filmed for documentaries or for university museum exhibitions, they're not immersive. It doesn't really give you the experience of being there. And I think playing a computer game set in Mesopotamia would be pretty cool. I'd enjoy that.
It would be I would enjoy it a lot too, because I have always felt that I don't know enough about Mesopotamia. So, I've taken a few courses as part of my PhD program. It doesn't stick with me as well as Egyptian stuff does. And I think that's just a matter of, where my interests lie. But I would love to know more about that world, and I think an Assassin's Creed game set in Mesopotamia is the best possible way for me to learn about it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And there are so many possibilities.
There are. I really would like to see like an ancient Israel component and like the resistance to like the Assyrian and Babylonian invasions of the Levant. I think there's really a lot there, and I think it would resonate with a lot of people, because especially if you grew up in a Christian household, you grew up hearing all these stories and seeing them in sort of watercolors and books in Sunday school, and they never really have felt real to me, but I was fascinated with them when I was a kid.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, I would enjoy that. And so that's kind of the end of the questions that I have prepared. So do you have any more images that you'd particularly like to show, or something in particular that you'd like to talk about some more?
Well, let's I'll do a screen share. Oh, whoops. And look at the photos. I think there were a few more things that I was going to talk about. Oh, this Easter egg, I absolutely love this. So in a number of pools in the game, there are whale fossils, which is based on reality. They found numerous whale skeletons because the area to the west of the Nile Valley was once a shallow sea, and that's where whales first evolved. I realize I'm getting
cool.
I'm getting kind of out of my area of expertise here pretty dramatically, but I've read various news stories about finding these early whale skeletons where they're sort of intermediates between the sort of the hooved wolf-like creature that whales evolved from and the ocean hunting creatures that whales are now. So that's really neat. I love this. This is the Pyramidion of the Great Pyramid, and you can see. Let's see if I can zoom in. You can see here the cartouche of Khufu, and the hieroglyphs are accurate. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah,
and actually, that's really, having that kind of reconstruction of the pyramids, I think, is really valuable, because something that we don't get so much, and this is going back to like the painting of statues and all of that kind of thing. You don't necessarily know what things originally looked like obviously if you look at them today, but if you read about them in textbooks, like you may not really absorb the fact that the pyramids had casing stones and were topped in gold. So having that is, I think, really valuable.
I think so too. I think it gives you a much better sense of why these things were worth building. Because if you look at the pyramids now, I mean, of course, they're amazing and huge and very interesting, but it's very easy to wonder, why in the world would anyone build this big pile of stones?
Yeah.
And then it's easy to imagine all sorts of absurd explanations for why they did it.
Grain silos
or alien landing pads or whatever they might be. But then when you see them with their stones and the gold top, you realize that this thing is just, it's beautiful. It's aesthetically pleasing. It's awe-inspiring. The man who built it must be a very powerful king to have created this thing. So you can understand their function much better if you can visualize them. This was a criticism that was meant to go along with language, and that they used the 𝀭Support hieroglyphs everywhere in the game. I just thought that was kind of funny, so you can see here, it's a hieroglyphic text editor. It's freely available online. It's called 𝀭Support, so the letter J, SESH, and I think it's sesh is sort of like scribe, and then it's Java based, so it's 𝀭Support. And you can use this to format and type out hieroglyphs, but it uses this standardized font that Egyptologists are very used to seeing, and it's really funny to see it.
It's kind of like Times New Roman.
Exactly, yeah. It's like seeing Times New Roman in like a piece of graphic design, and it's like, wait, I don't think that's finished yet. And then I'll just the last thing I'll show is cats. So there are cats everywhere. You can pet them and befriend them. You can't kill them, just like you can't kill innocent people. That will cause you to, desynchronize, basically dying in Assassin's Creed. But there's a bunch of Egyptian 𝀭s. Really cool. It's a native Egyptian breed of cat. It's the only cat where its spots are also reflected on its skin, so that that coloring pattern is also on the skin underneath the fur. And they're called 𝀭s because that's related to the Egyptian word for cat, which in Coptic is 𝀭mu, and then was probably something like Mao in earlier stages of Egyptian. So
that's awesome.
They call cats 𝀭ws.
I'm a fan of any game that puts cats front and center. I think that's fantastic. So if you have questions for Christian, now is the time to get them in. We'll probably go another 10 minutes maybe. So if you have questions, put them in the side chat and we will relay them. Milwaukee Atheists is saying, what are the best books or scholars to read when learning about coffin texts?
There's a few different things. I think Faulkner has a collection of the coffin texts. The easiest way for me to answer this is just to look at my library real quick.
Yeah, sure.
So my advisor, Allen, James Allen, wrote a translation of the coffin texts, which is, I think it's good, of course. Let's see what else I have here.
I personally free to download everyone from the University of Chicago website. So I'm going to put that link in the description box and in the side chat. So if you feel like reading it, you can just download it and take a look.
Yeah, it's freely available online. I think the is it Faulkner? I didn't label my file with the author's name, so I don't remember exactly who wrote it. But there's a collection of the coffin texts, and let me go back and share my screen real quick just to show you what this looks like. Mm-hmm. So there's a collection of the coffin texts that includes, all multiple different versions and the glyphs. This is not an incredibly high quality document, but they're all identified by what's the word for that? The text edition.
Oh,
witness or
yeah, I'd say witness or exemplar.
Exemplar, yeah.
But I
so
don't
they're
know
all
if that's right.
and then put in parallel, and then you can pair that with a translation like Alan's translation, and then
Fantastic, thank you. Do we have any more questions, everybody? And if you are watching, by the way, and you like what you have seen, please hit the like button. Subscribe if you are not already subscribed. We'd love to have you. And yes, we've got maybe 2 more minutes. If we don't get any questions, then I will wrap up sooner. But thank you all for joining us. This has been really fun. And I should say now, one of the things that I'm trying to organize, it may not happen this year because I do need to graduate, which involves finishing my dissertation. But soon, maybe next year, I want to do a live stream or a series of live streams of academics playing through Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Assassin's Creed Origins, and kind of commenting on what they find particularly interesting and pointing out historical tidbits. So that's something I'm going to try and do. I've not done it yet because, as I've said, I have very little time and I should really be writing my PhD. But that is at least a plan for the future. Oh, Enkidu is asking about HAPS. So for those who don't know, HAPS is our scholarship program. We've been raising money to fund PhD research over this coming summer. And we've nearly got enough to fund 3 students, which is very, very exciting. So thank you everyone for contributing. And we're in the process of scheduling interviews, which will be broadcast live, so you can all come and ask your questions. So keep your eyes on the calendar. That's digitalhammurabi.com/calendar. As soon as I have them scheduled definitively, I'll put that up. And then we'll go through the voting process and the selection process to decide who should receive the money. And we have a couple of questions. Richard Madsen, Mr. Casey, were there portions of the game that a person might take too seriously, leading them away from understanding the actuality? So I think that means are there sections in the game that are not realistic that could be misunderstood as being historically accurate by a non-expert?
That's a great question. I feel like that's something I really should have looked for myself and presented. Let me see if I can think of anything really quickly. The answer to this one might end up having to be, I don't know.
That's absolutely fine.
Let me see. So one of the things that sort of stuck out to me was the verticality of the game. So Assassin's Creed is this climbing, jumping, fighting game. So they overemphasized the verticality of a lot of places. The Nile Valley is relatively flat with some low desert hills on both sides. So it's not exactly the same. I don't know if that would really lead anyone astray. I think the one thing that I did notice, so in the game you can pretty much go anywhere, and that's kind of the idea. You go into places and then maybe people try to fight you and you have to fight back. But when it applies to temples, it's fairly unrealistic. So there's a point where you go to a temple in 𝀭and you meet the priest there, who you seem to already know, and you play hide and seek with his children. And in the process, you go into the sanctuary, you run around where all the priests are doing their things. You certainly couldn't have done that in ancient Egypt. The interior of the temple was shut off, and understanding that is important for understanding Egyptian religion as something much more akin to what we call science today, where they were sort of genuinely trying to understand the world and modifying their beliefs according to new things that they learned. And part of that process included discovering the secrets of the universe and holding them as secrets, because that imparted a certain element of religious authority to the priesthood. And that's a really crucial component of ancient Egyptian society. It's a crucial component of understanding how later people, especially the Greeks and then various European people, looked back on Egypt as being this land of these sort of esoteric, profound mysteries, because they were sort of doing something very like an early form of research into natural science, and then holding that information secret and protecting the interior of the temple where rituals related to that were being performed as a means of preserving their authority. So
Thank you. That was actually something that kind of I would have wondered about, because we have the same thing in Mesopotamia. It's debated how open temples were, but the answer is probably not terribly. And one of the joys of an open plan game like that is you can literally go anywhere, even though it might not be terribly historically accurate. One of the things that always gets me about games like Zelda is you can just randomly barge into people's houses, and they may be a bit confused about why you're there, but they're probably not going to kick you out.
Yeah. Assassin's Creed Origins is like that too. I think Odyssey, they changed that so that if you just kind of loot things in front of people or in someone's house, they will try to fight back, and it will like damage your reputation or whatever. But yeah, it's the same thing. You can kind of wander into people's houses and take some coins out of a jar and walk back out, and they just go on with what they were doing.
I'm like, I didn't need that anyway. Yeah. Okay, Yami Yomizuki says, what would be some good resources for a layperson who wants to research the pronunciation of ancient Egyptian?
Oh, that's a great question. So unfortunately, the answer to that is that really no such resources exist. So one of the reasons I really wanted to study with Jim Allen at Brown was because he wrote a book about Middle Egyptian that's designed to be very accessible, and it includes kind of the linguistic terminology, but it explains it all every time, and it's really designed to kind of teach you Egyptian from an Egyptologist's perspective, but from square one. So that would be a useful place to look. So it's James P. Allen. I think it's called Middle Egyptian: An Introduction to the Language and Culture of Hieroglyphs. It's in its 3rd edition now. If you're curious, feel free to email me and we can discuss all of the various scholarly discussions and disagreements and things. And I can suggest other sources as well. But it's a great question, because I noticed that was really a problem. And I've suspected for a long time that this artificial pronunciation sort of hurts our ability to reify this language, or to think in the language, or to become fluent in some way. So there's linguistic research on second language acquisition, and one of the sort of common tenets is that speaking and listening is super important. That's why things like Duolingo, you have a speaking component and a listening component. We don't have that for Egyptian. So I created a class. I teach it as part of the Summer at Brown program. It's a 2-week course, and I created a workbook for that where you have all the Egyptian vocabulary, and then with it you have all of the Coptic equivalents. And then in class we actually just use the Coptic pronunciation to read things and to refer to words. And I did an experiment a couple of years ago where I split the class into 2 groups, and I gave one the Coptic and I didn't give the other one Coptic. And this is all voluntary and approved and everything. But the students who had the Coptic performed slightly better on their vocabulary exams, which indicates that they were retaining vocabulary better by having a pronunciation. My result, I think my p-value was like 0.054 or something, so not quite statistically significant. I'm hoping to one day do a what's it called, MOOC, massive open online course, where I then do that same experiment with much higher sample sizes and kind of definitively say, yes, having Coptic and using it to pronounce things is helpful. I also found that students who learned the Coptic were also kind of internalizing sound changes that happen over time. For example, there are a number of consonants in Egyptian that sort of moved slightly in between late Egyptian and Coptic. So when you see the written version in Egyptian, it's like seeing the word being spelt slightly differently than the Coptic version. And students were very good at sort of just intuiting what happened. So a sound that was more like cha eventually becomes more like ta or something like that. It's all very intuitive, but it's very hard to teach if you just explain a bunch of phonetic rules. It's much easier if you just see a lot of examples and kind of intuit it yourself. That the workbook for that class is freely available as a PDF on my website. You're welcome to go download it. And then you're also welcome to email me with questions and if you need help working through it. And I think that's
thank you. I'll put the link to that in the description. If anyone is interested, check down there. And then you can get in touch with Christian through his website. We have one more question. Garrett Murdoch, many of the pyramids require you to do a lot of climbing, vaulting, and navigating within origins. Is this accurate to the size of the inside of the pyramids?
No. So in the Great Pyramid is the perfect example. So there's a French architect who came up with a hypothesis for the building of the pyramid. I think his name is Jean-Pierre Houdin. I would have to double check it, or I would just like to double check it because I like to say things that are correct, but memory doesn't always allow you to do that. Anyway, so he has this hypothesis that the pyramid was built using an internal spiral ramp. So basically they built this big, spiral pyramid shape and used that spiral ramp to put all the stones on top and then added the casing stones and covered the spiral ramp on the way down and made a pyramid shape. There's some compelling sort of circumstantial evidence for that hypothesis. It might end up being correct. We don't really know. But Ubisoft decided that they preferred that hypothesis primarily because it allowed them to add interior corridors and chambers that are not known to exist. So when you're going around inside the pyramid, you're actually going around in a sort of hypothetical internal structure that doesn't actually exist.
Okay, that's interesting. So Richard, that's another thing that might be misleading for non-specialists playing the game. That's very interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, lovely. We have no more questions, and I don't have any more questions. But thank you so much for joining this. This is really interesting. And hopefully, as and when I get my act together, we can do a live stream, a gaming live stream. Again, after the dissertation is complete, because I think I will go insane if I don't graduate soon.
I can relate to that.
Thank you, everybody, for joining me and for your lovely questions for Christian. I saw a question. We don't have a book club tonight. I think we're planning on doing our 6,000 live stream celebration tomorrow. I'm not sure what time. I'll put something up as soon as we work that out. But Josh and Skylar are doing a couple of live streams tonight. I think there's one on Skylar's show and then one on Digital Fiction. So Josh is otherwise engaged, and I am going to put a desk together, which is always exciting. I'm a fan of flat pack furniture. So thank you all again. Thank you, Christian. And we will see you all soon.